This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Why is there so much dysfunction in Congress? Constitutional scholar Ian Millhiser says simply, it's deeply baked into the legislative system. Author and demographer Phillip Longman has some surprising data about how your job determines how long you live and how winning an Oscar affects health in Hollywood. And Bill Press talks with Brendon Ayanbadejo of the world champion Baltimore Ravens about safety on the gridiron and gay rights. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Constitutional law expert Ian Millhiser says the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court may not lead to more Republicans, but it will lead to worse Democrats. He also says the so-called upper house, the Senate, is actually more representative of the American people than the People's House. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Ian Millhiser is the senior constitutional policy analyst for American Progress, where his work focuses on the Constitution and the judiciary. Ian previously was a policy analyst and blogger for Think Progress, held the open government portfolio for Center for American Progress's Doing What Works project, and was a legal research analyst with Think Progress during the nomination and confirmation of Justice Sonia Sotomayor to the United States Supreme Court. Ian, always good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
Political scientists Norman Ornstein and Thomas Mann recently made a splash by concluding that while both parties are responsible for congressional gridlock, the blame lies largely with Republicans. Agree?
Well, I think the data on this is very clear. One way that we can measure how often filibusters are used is by how often the majority leader calls a vote to try to break a filibuster. And when Mitch McConnell, the current Republican minority leader in the Senate, became minority leader, the number of those what are called cloture votes, where you're trying to break a filibuster, doubled overnight, and they've stayed at an historically high level ever since. So there's no question that we're seeing obstruction now at a level that never existed before. And I think the reason why is clear. The conservative movement in this country, for whatever reason, has decided to take a very nihilistic approach to government. There are people who honestly don't think it's a problem if we don't fund the government for months at a time. There are people who honestly don't think it's a problem if the government loses its ability to borrow money at a decent rate because we default on our debt. And if you don't think it's a problem if we don't have basic social services, or if we don't have the FBI, or if we don't have, any of the other things that we count on our government to do, then sure, why not engage in extortion? Why not threaten to blow everything up or not be willing to pass basic bills in order to get what you want? And so the problem is, I think you have a problem of power here, where the party that's willing to shoot the hostage, legitimately has more power than the party that's not willing to blow everything up, and so at some point, is going to have to give in to certain demands.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Senate was consciously designed over 2 centuries ago to be less democratic, that's with a small d, than the House. Is that distinction no longer workable for the common good?
Well, here's, to go back to a point that we had discussed in another conversation. There is such serious gerrymandering in the House right now that despite the fact that the Senate is supposed to be the least democratic part of the elected branches, despite the fact that the Senate is malapportioned so that voters in Wyoming, where almost no one lives, get the same amount of representation as voters in California, which has 6th of the state's population, despite all the problems that our Senate has, the makeup of the Senate right now more closely resembles the will of the people than the makeup of the House. 1.4 million more Americans voted for a Democratic member of the House than voted for a Republican, but the Republicans have a pretty substantial majority in the House. And it just goes to show you, how effective those gerrymanders are, that you wind up with the branch that's supposed to be the more Democratic House looking significantly less like the will of the people than the malapportioned Senate.
We're speaking with Ian Millhiser, Senior Constitutional Policy Analyst for the Center for American Progress. So what's the solution to congressional dysfunction? I mean, is it getting rid of the filibuster rule? Is it banning senatorial holds on nominations? Is it amending the Constitution itself? I mean, what do we do here?
Well, I mean, getting rid of the filibuster would be a start. But, I think it's important to understand just how deeply baked into our congressional system the dysfunction is. A bill can be held up at the committee level if it doesn't have majority support in the committee, even though it may have majority support in the House as a whole. You can have the situation you have frequently in the House right now, where a majority of the House members support it, but John Boehner will refuse to bring it to the floor because a majority of the Republican caucus doesn't support it. Our system has problems built upon problems to keep laws from happening. And the filibuster is a big one. But if we were serious about making sure that our Congress was able to, to function in a way that reflects the will of the majority, there's a lot more reform that needs to happen.
So that's a little lower on the list of things that need to be done.
I think that there's.
In terms of priority. Yeah. Okay.
I think that the list is long. I don't know that I'm necessarily willing to rank the things, but you look at the committee structure, you look at the problem of individuals having the power to stop bills that are supported by a whole legislature, you look at the filibuster, you look at many of these other things that are baked into the cake of our system, and it leads to a government that's almost designed to be dysfunctional.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Supreme Court may have to decide the legality of President Obama's recess appointments to the National Labor Relations Board and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau because the nominations were made when the Senate was technically in session. So two questions here. Does the president have a case? And number two, by defying Senate rules, didn't he recklessly tempt the court to remove this important power for all future presidents?
Well, with this Supreme Court, I think you can't predict what they're going to do or when they're going to decide to be reckless.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's a fool's game to look at the Roberts Court and say, oh, maybe if I change my behavior, they'll stop being the jerks that they've always been. With respect to the recess appointments question, so the rule that has always been understood for the last 100 years regarding recess appointments is that a recess exists when the Senate is not capable of doing the confirmation process. So regardless of whether they adjourn in a certain way or whether they pass a certain resolution saying that they're in recess, if the members of Congress are physically present in the Senate chamber and are engaged in a process that will allow them to confirm a nominee, it's not a recess. If they're dispersed throughout the country to their various districts and the Senate isn't really in session and they have no way to carry on a confirmation, that's a recess. And that's what the president relied on when he made these appointments. There's only been one court that has struck down the president's recess appointments, and I would be absolutely stunned if the Supreme Court agrees with the reasoning in that court's opinion, because that court's opinion was so sweeping. It didn't just eliminate these handful of recess appointments. It would eliminate many hundreds of past recess appointments that no one has ever thought were controversial, and of course would call into question whether the actions that those officials took were lawful. I saw a list of some of the officials on that list. One is a former Secretary of State. Does that mean that the diplomatic agreements that were negotiated by that person when he was a recess appointment were unlawful? There's a former judge on that list. Does that mean that every decision that that judge made is now a lawless decision that has to be overruled? So I'd be very surprised if the Supreme Court goes down the very reckless road that this lower court goes down.
The whole thing just seemed so almost like they were cheating. What is it? A conference call every day, so that way they were technically in session, and that just can't fly. I just can't see how that would.
Yeah, I mean, let's back up a step and explain how we got to the recess appointment. So, in 2010, Congress passed a law creating the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Mm-hmm. That was validly enacted Congress. The House and the Senate passed it. The President signed it. And if you want to repeal that law creating that agency, the Constitution says you need the House and the Senate to pass a bill repealing it, and the President needs to sign that, or his veto needs to be overridden. That's what the Constitution said. The Republicans, when the Republicans decided that they did not want that CFPB to be able to exist at least the way it exists right now. But they didn't have the votes to pass it through both houses of Congress, to pass a repeal through both houses of Congress, and Obama wasn't going to sign it. So they found this loophole where they determined that if they just confirm no one, if they filibuster any person that Obama nominates, no matter who that person is, to lead this agency, it'll mean that that agency isn't allowed to do most of its functions, and it'll be the same thing as if they had passed a repeal bill, even though they don't have the constitutionally required majorities to pass that repeal bill. So that's what's at stake here. What's at stake here is whether or not the minority party in one house of Congress has the ability to effectively repeal a duly enacted act of Congress. And if they do, that's very frightening.
Mm-hmm. What's your opinion on how much the Citizens United decision is responsible for gridlock and congressional dysfunction? I mean, why can't progressives simply fight the secret power brokers of the right on their own terms with liberal super PACs with secret donors?
I mean, I don't know if I'd blame Citizens United for dysfunction just because the dysfunction existed before Citizens United was decided.
Okay.
I think that the problem that Citizens United creates in the long run, in the short term, it led to much more money going to Republicans than to Democrats because Republicans leaped at the opportunity to get all this new money, and Democrats were uneasy with it. I think in the long term, you're right that Democrats are realizing they can't unilaterally disarm. You're seeing more Democratic super PACs and, attempts to reach out to wealthy donors. Now, there's probably more big money donors on the Republican side than on the Democratic side, so there's always going to be a bit of a Republican advantage there. But the long-term problem, I don't think it's going to be that Republicans are spending so much more money or Republican donors are spending so much more money than Democratic donors are. I think the long-term problem is that every minute that a Democratic elected official spends sucking up to a rich guy or a rich corporation is a moment that they cannot spend learning how to do their job right. It's a moment they can't spend interacting with their actual constituents. It's a moment they can't spend learning policy. And it's a moment where they are thinking about how do I have to change the way I operate in order to please this rich guy. Okay. And so ultimately, Citizens United doesn't just lead to more Republicans, it leads to worse Democrats.
Right, absolutely. So in other words, Citizens United needs to go away.
Right, and I think, hopefully if there is a vacancy in the Supreme Court, at least one of the five in the Citizens United majority, that will be one of the top priorities of the newly constituted court is to correct that error that they made.
I would hope so. Ian Millhiser is Senior Constitutional Policy Analyst for Center for American Progress. Thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon.
All right, thank you.
Have a great one. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Phillip Longman has written extensively about race and class in America, and while it may seem obvious that minorities have worse health relative to whites, so do people making $100,000 a year compared to those making $150,000 a year. That's coming up in just a moment. But right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
In the wealthiest nation on earth, President Obama declared in his State of the Union speech, no one who works full-time should have to live in poverty. Right. Not only does his call to raise America's minimum wage put some real pop in populism, but it could finally start putting some ethics back in our country's much celebrated but rarely honored work ethic. Kudos to Obama for putting good economics and good morals together, and for putting this long overdue increase on the front burner. But then came the number, $9 an hour. Excuse me, Mr. President, but that means a person who works full-time would nonetheless, quote, have to live in poverty. Yes, $9 is $1.75 better than the current pay, but it's still a poverty wage, and it doesn't even elevate the buying power of our wage floor back to where it was in 1968. This is not merely about extending a badly needed helping hand to people struggling to work their way out of poverty, but about them giving a jolt of new energy to our economy, which it desperately needs. Ironically, while super-rich corporations are hoarding trillions of dollars in offshore accounts, refusing to invest in America, minimum wage workers invest every extra dollar they get in America, spending it right where they live on clothing, food, health care, and other needs. A 2011 Federal Reserve study found that a $1 hike in the minimum wage produces an additional $2,800 a year in spending by each of those households. So this is no time to shortchange these workers. This is Jim Hightower saying, yes, I know that congressional Republicans and corporate lobbyists oppose even a $9 wage. But a poll last June found that 7 out of 10 Americans, including a majority of Republicans, support raising the wage above $10 an hour. This is a time, Mr. President, to think big and take it to the grassroots.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Do race and class matter in healthcare? Absolutely, says demographer Phillip Longman. It's not only the level of socioeconomic status, it's the disparity between the races and income levels that kills people. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Phillip Longman is senior editor of the Washington Monthly, a senior fellow at the New America Foundation, and teaches healthcare policy at Johns Hopkins University. Phillip, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, you've been thinking and writing about how racial and economic disparities affect health and life expectancy in the United States. Can you give a few examples of the relationship?
Well, we have tremendous disparities in how long people live in different parts of the country. And those correlations or disparities do not correlate very well with the income that people have, but they correlate very strongly with how much income inequality there is where they live. So, for example, people in Mississippi white people in Mississippi, for example, don't live anywhere near as long as white people do in Minnesota. And one big difference between those two states is the degree of income inequality. The sort of classic insight into this truth that inequality kills comes from studies that were done starting in the early 1960s of British civil servants. Now, British civil servants have a lot in common with each other, right? They're not none of them are really rich, and none of them are really poor. None of them face any kind of occupational hazard beyond perhaps getting a paper cut. Right.
Which can be pretty stressful.
It can be, infection and all that kind of stuff,
Sure.
right? And of course, they all have equal access to the so-called socialized British healthcare system. But what's been revealed is that there is this tremendous difference in how long people live depending where they are on the organizational chart of the British Civil Service. So people at that top of that chart live way longer than people at the bottom of the chart. The administrators live a lot longer than the clerks and the typists. And even more strangely, every time you go up one ring in that hierarchical chart, your life expectancy improves. And every time you go down one rung, I should say, it gets worse. So that's pretty hard to explain, except that the same pattern shows up in other workplaces, in other counties, cities, countries, east and west, all forms of government, all forms of healthcare delivery system. And so it turns out to be a rather powerful determinant of how long we live and how healthy we are.
Well, so then does this mean that, let's say, a senior vice president at a company will live longer than a junior vice president? I mean, let's say that's the senior vice president's making $150,000 a year, the junior vice president's making $100,000 a year. There's only $50,000 separating. Both are good incomes, but that senior vice president is likely to live longer?
Yes.
Wow.
Totally. And it's the disparity. It's not one could be earning $50,000 and the other could be making $100,000, and it's the disparity that counts. Not that one makes $100,000 and one makes $150,000. It's the difference between the two of them.
I see. Huh.
In other words, the inequality, right? I mean, at both those income levels, people have access to health care, they have enough food to eat, they have shelter, right? And yet you have this dramatically different life expectancy.
Well, and on the surface, they both may be very happy in their jobs, too.
Could be.
Right?
Could be. And if you talk to the top manager, he'll probably tell you about how stressed he is by the burdens of command, the fact that he's got all these responsibilities. And there's a kind of stereotype that goes about, that has the hard-charging type A executive dying of a heart attack at 50, right? But that turns out to not have much basis in reality. That it's not the hard-charging guy at the top of the hierarchy that tends to croak early. It's his cowering subordinates beneath him who do. And the relationship is so strong that even though there may be some differences in lifestyle between people on different parts of the hierarchy, as you go down the hierarchy, people are more likely to smoke, for example. But it turns out that, say, smoking 2 packs of cigarettes when you're at the top of the hierarchy isn't anywhere near as dangerous to your health as smoking 2 packs when you're at the bottom of the hierarchy.
So if you want to smoke, don't try and achieve too much in life.
Well, to put this in human terms, think about this very famous, long-lived alcoholic named Winston Churchill, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's the guy that completely abused himself, right? I take it was like in the bathtub recovering from his hangovers every single day until noon, right? But lived to a ripe old age. But Winston Churchill could tell himself at the end of every day that he was getting important stuff done, right? Whereas people at the bottom of the chain often can't do that. I mean, they live in a world in which other people seem to have it all, in which they seem to have no prospect, that they can't come up with rules of the game whereby they're winners, and oftentimes they take it out on themselves through drinking too much, through smoking too much, and like that. So that's maybe part of the psychology, if you will, of why this works, right? The biochemistry of it seems to be related to this steroid called cortisol, that people who find themselves in positions where they have responsibility but without authority, where they get blamed for things when stuff goes wrong, but they can't really do anything about it. They don't control their workplace. They tend to have these elevated levels of cortisol, and we know from other studies that having those elevated levels of cortisol is puts you at much higher risk for diabetes and other diseases. So that may be the molecular explanation for why this happens.
Very interesting. We're speaking with Phillip Longman, senior editor of the Washington Monthly, senior fellow at the New America Foundation, also teaches healthcare policy at Johns Hopkins University. So a lot of difference in health and life expectancy has to do with the subjective factors such as stress and lack of control over one's life and that kind of thing, I guess. What has research found about longevity and winning an Oscar?
Well, that's a fun factoid, that if you look at people who over the years have won Oscars and compare their life expectancy to people who were nominated for Oscars but didn't win, the people who won the Oscars live 4 years longer on average than just the ones that were nominated. And 4 years is a big deal because, if we eliminated all heart disease tomorrow and in the United States, life expectancy would go up by only 4 years. So what is it about winning an Oscar that makes you live so much longer than if you're merely nominated for one? I'm not sure. I don't think it's because, people with better genes tend to win Oscars. But again, it points to this phenomenon of being on the bottom of some hierarchy, or even somewhere in the middle, or even very near the top, but not at the top, tends to lower your life expectancy.
So the winning quarterback of the Super Bowl is probably going to live longer than the losing quarterback of the Super Bowl. I mean, you could break it down to just about anything then, athletes, other top performers, I guess.
Yeah. I'm not aware of any studies that have looked at Super Bowl quarterbacks.
Right, and I didn't mean to insinuate that you had done any studies about that, but I just thought I'd toss that out there as a possibility.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it's true.
Interesting.
Now, for somebody to do.
Yeah. You also point out rather starkly, using a map of the Washington, D.C. area, that longevity depends on your zip code. In one case, a distance of just 10 miles yielding a difference of 8 years of longevity. Explain that one. Yeah,
well, that's pretty amazing. So if you're here in Washington, D.C. and you get on the metro at Union Station and you ride for 10 minutes down the red line, life expectancy in between the two places, as you say, increases by 8 years. It's hard to tease out what all is going on there. You're going from one neighborhood that's poorer than the other, and yet we have found that when poor people move from poor neighborhoods to richer neighborhoods under, for example, a public housing program that the federal government set up. So poor people remain poor, but no longer live in poor neighborhoods, now live in middle-class neighborhoods. Their life expectancy goes up. And they also lose weight, and all kinds of other good things happen.
That's just
very
amazing.
Hard to tease out. Yeah, it's very hard to tease out what all may be going on there.
Right.
But,
I mean, just the list of factors is probably goes on forever and ever.
But here's one thing that's big, right? If you're living in a poor neighborhood, you're probably living in a food desert, right? You don't have access to fresh food. There's a liquor store on every corner. There's all kinds of things that may tempt you into unhealthy lifestyles. And not so much, if you go up the red line 10 minutes and get off in this other neighborhood where there's a Whole Foods and where there isn't a crack market and like that.
Yeah. Well, it's some pretty amazing studies here, and I guess it's something that's going to keep you busy for quite some time as you look more and more into it. Phillip Longman, senior editor of the Washington Monthly, senior fellow at the New America Foundation, also teaches healthcare policy at Johns Hopkins University. Phillip, as always, great to talk with you here today on AmericasDemocrats.org, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Pleasure. Take care.
Thank you. You too. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Baltimore Ravens linebacker Brendon Ayanbadejo.
It is a big day for us here at the Full Court Press. We have had many important politicians in the studio with us, United States senators, members of Congress, members of the President's cabinet, members of the President's team at the White House. Never have we had a Super Bowl champion here in the Full Court Press studios, and we are so pleased to welcome to the studio today Brendon Ayanbadejo, who is the great linebacker for the Super Bowl champs Baltimore Ravens. Brendon, good to see you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Congratulations.
Yeah, congratulations. That's
Thank
awesome.
you. I don't think the luster ever wears off, so I'm still on cloud nine.
Yeah. Well, you ought to be. I mean, you guys work so hard, and particularly postseason. What's it feel like to bring that home for the people of Baltimore and for your team, huh?
I mean, it's quite amazing because you grow up and you see it. I actually lived in Chicago in 1985 and saw that Bears team win the championship, and then I moved to Northern California and I saw the 49ers bring several championships home.
Right.
So to be able to be in that same company, to be a part of an organization that actually gets a Super Bowl done, and having failed earlier in my career, it kind of made amends for every loss I've ever had. So it feels amazing. The city came out and celebrated with us, and that was actually the most exciting part of it, was doing the parade in Baltimore when we got back.
That was huge in Baltimore. I mean, you filled the stadium and then filled all the downtown streets, and it was great.
It was on the verge of pandemonium. The fans were so excited and so over the top, but still, respected our space and our distance, but wanted to share every moment with us. It was definitely a moment I'll never forget.
Do you feel a little guilty about taking the game away from 49? You're from Northern California. Take it away from the 49ers?
Absolutely not. To the victor goes the spoils, and I've been on the other side of, I've been to a Super Bowl in 2006 with the Chicago Bears versus the Patriots and Peyton Manning, and against the Indianapolis Colts and Peyton Manning, and so you kind of walk around every day with a little bit of hurt inside you from that. So some people never recover from that loss, and luckily I got to make amends for it.
All right, give us a little scoop. What happens to Joe Flacco now?
Oh man, he's gonna have to get a new bank account because there's not going to be enough zeros in the one he has now.
He deserves whatever he gets, man.
Absolutely, he played lights out, and I knew from his rookie year that he was going to be the greatest quarterback in Baltimore history, and now he's going on to be one of the greatest quarterbacks in the NFL.
Yeah, absolutely. So he's open. I forget the phrase, but his contract is up. So he's a free agent.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Do you expect him to stay?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He's not going anywhere.
So,
yeah. I mean, with one great player going out, and now you have this other great player there, you have to seize him. You have to capture him.
They'll find a way.
They will get it done.
Is Major League Football a violent sport?
Absolutely.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the game is...
Does that worry you?
No, it doesn't. I mean, you know what you're signing up for, but definitely I think my parents did the right thing by not letting me play full contact football until I was in high school.
Really?
And,
that's interesting.
Yeah, and being a father and having a son, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm not going to let my son play at Pop Warner, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. That's just too young. And if he's going to be a professional player or whatever he wants to do, but especially with football, I just don't want him to have all those traumatic compacts over and over again on his brain.
So you think the president might have been right on when he said recently, and got a little flack for it, that if he had a son, he would think twice about letting him play football? Yeah,
absolutely. And I've always preached the same thing, and I've seen what happens after you've had repeated blows to the head. And I was a teammate of Junior Seau's in that unfortunate situation. So a lot of people believe the NFL withheld information as to what happens with you when you have those compacts over and over again, and not necessarily just concussions, just the impacts. And you also see some long-term effects in soccer players as well from heading the ball throughout the course of a soccer career. So, with technology and information, we're learning new things. But I think with the helmet being so blunt, I think if they put a foam over the helmet, something similar to how this binder right here is kind of soft. It has cardboard around it. But imagine if they just had a thin layer of foam, so the helmet wouldn't be so blunt and hard. I think that would make a big difference. I'm not a scientist, but I'm just saying, when you have two hard objects hitting each other.
Sure.
It's a lot more blunt.
Is the NFL working on that at all?
I know there's companies working on new kinds of helmets and different kind of protection, but I'm not sure if they have that type of thing going on.
And is the NFL ready for an openly gay football player?
Well, I think we're setting the precedence with the Baltimore Ravens and the San Francisco 49ers already doing what they do and speaking out against discrimination. I think those two organizations have set the precedence, but I'd really like to see the NFL as a whole step up and as a whole somewhat similar to how hockey and how the NBA has done it. Go out there and make a statement, say it's okay. And instead of teams, coming out on their own, the Niners did it gets better. And when I was attacked earlier this year, the team backed me up and supported me and said that they don't believe in discrimination. So, you have a precedence for two teams doing it, but you don't have a precedence for the entire NFL doing it. I think when they do that, we'll go light years ahead. But
that's a really good point.
We're close.
That's really good because nobody's been louder about it and stronger on it than you have in the NFL, and especially leading up to the Super Bowl. And I'll say it when Chris Culver made his comments about how he wouldn't play with a gay teammate
from the Niners,
from the 49ers, and I really was hoping to see the NFL really sort of come down strong on him and say, look, we accept everybody, but they were pretty quiet on it.
Yeah, surprisingly quiet. And you're alienating a whole demographic of football fans and people in general that would jump on board and start watching the NFL. And you'd think for the most popular sport in America, it'd be a lot more accepting.
What kind of response did you get from your teammates when you you used the phrase Jackie Robinson, the analogies, kind of break through in sports?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of guys, based on where they're raised, they don't see it as a civil rights movement, as an equal rights movement. So we're just trying to, make them aware of what really is going on. It really is a civil rights issue. It's not just gay rights. It's everybody's rights in general. So guys are kind of, as we educate and as we talk about this, guys are starting to really open up their minds and their hearts to the situation.
Yeah, it was interesting in in the inaugural address, President Obama put Selma and Stonewall in the same sentence, right, making the point you've made, that it's all part and a continuation, if you will, of the safe movement. So it's like there's no rest for the weary. So you come right off the football field and you jump right into getting your MBA at George Washington University. It's a special program there, and tell us about it. Yeah,
it's the Star MBA program. I'm actually in the inaugural class. We started in 2011, late 2011, and now we're going to be wrapping up in 2013. But, with all these customized educations and being a professional athlete, we have to have a really customized schedule. And if you want to go to school and you want to really have a higher education and a personal learning experience, then, you have to find a place that's going to have a customized customized education for you and where you can really benefit. So the schedule is tailored around our schedule. So we do all of our classes during the off season, and there's also some online courses during the season, but it just is such a huge difference to be able to sit in the classroom and get this real-time learning experience with the teachers.
No, I mean, that's great. And how big is the program? And is it all just a sport?
No, it's not. It's young professionals. So I want to say the inaugural class has maybe 40 students, and maybe there's another 30 to 40 tailoring behind us. And that's pretty impressive for a school that's for a program that's only 2 years old. And it's just been a major learning experience. I've come light years in my business acumen, and whether it's accounting or marketing or financial markets, global markets. So I've come a long way.
What do you want to do with it?
Well, I want to be an athletic director. So I'm all about higher education. And the reason I want to be an athletic director is not just so I can watch a lot of free sports, is also so
there is that.
There's that perk, but also when student athletes, when they graduate from school, there's not really a place for them to go because they give so much of their time and effort to playing that sport that they're not really job ready and ready for corporate America. So I want to build in a secondary education, a master's degree, and internships with relationships that the school has, and really further on our student athletes for corporate America.
All right. Well, I want you to know that you've been here now in the studio. The lights did not go out. We made sure that we had the
Don't steal my thunder, baby.
You are as impressive off the field as you are on the field. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Ian Millhiser, Phillip Longman, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org